Hi there, everyone, and welcome to this channel based on mental health, well-being, and self-love. Today's video, we're going to be looking at a mental health book recommendation, and this mental health book recommendation is so self-reflective and interesting and insightful as it looks at the foundation of self-love towards all our other relationships in our lives and also every other aspect of our lives. Joining me today is the co-author of How to Love Yourself and Sometimes Other People, Lodro Rinzler. Welcome, Lodro.
Hello, nice to be here.
So, Lodro, why don't you start us off and tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you are passionate about?
Sure. So I was actually raised in a Buddhist household. I'm from New York City originally, but my parents had begun practicing Tibetan Buddhism in their 20s. So by the time that I came around, it was sort of just in the household. And I started doing retreats, meditation retreats when I was 11, and then longer ones when I was about 17 or so. And then began teaching meditation at the request of some of my mentors sometime around 18. So it's been about 20 some odd years at this point, without giving away my age. And it's been a long journey, I would say, of sort of exploring some of these concepts of how do we integrate the elements of very traditional Buddhism into everyday life. And I think a lot of what we'll be talking about today, it's not necessarily like Lodro Rinzler's ideas of love and Buddhism and so on and so forth. It's just something that's been around for 2,600 years that I just happen to know something about. So I'll just be reflecting what the Buddha taught and what other teachers have taught over this long lineage of individuals who have grappled with these topics and ideally share some of what they have learned with us.
And that what is so interesting about this book is that the other co-author looked at it from a Christian perspective and a lot of reference to Mary Magdalene, and the two of you kind of spoke about and integrated together a shared looking at humanity and relationships and self-love from these perspectives. So why don't you tell us what brought you to writing this book with Megan?
Sure, it's a great question. Megan and I first met, we were invited not so far down the road now that I think about it. I just happened to live nearby this particular bookstore that invited us, God, a decade ago to come and be on a panel. They have a large sort of conference with many different types of authors and many different genres, and we were the sort of spiritual panel. And we hit it off, and we became friends shortly thereafter, and sort of traded. At that point, our first books had both been recently out, and I really devoured hers in a day. And it was this interesting exploration because, yes, it comes from a Christian theological background, but the work of Mary Magdalene that Megan's been doing for many, many years is really revolves around the idea that God and divinity is within us. And from the Buddhist point of view, we have the no enlightenment, which is essentially us just waking up to things as they are, and the potential to wake up exists within us. It's not something we have to go out and buy. We don't have to go to a Walmart and get it. It's not found in a relationship. It's something that we have. So we had this sort of initial joining of her very Christian background, my very Buddhist background, around this particular notion that, relevant to our topic today, that we're a sort of whole, complete good as is. That is who we inherently are. And then sometimes we get confused from that and we act in confused ways. But ultimately, the core of who we are is what I would call Buddha nature. She refers to as divinity. But it is that sense of wholeness that we've been talking about. So we became friends at that point, and gosh, I have no clue. It's been so many years since we've actually written this book. I feel like it was probably 8 years ago that we wrote this book. And it is something that grew out of our friendship. I don't think either of us ever thought we would co-write a book with another person, but it was this moment in time that we ourselves were sort of grappling with what it means to really focus on this element. And I feel like this gets a lot of like lip service, but not a lot of explanation of like how to love yourself, self-love. And then how that then can manifest in the relationships around us. So much of this particular book of how to love yourself and sometimes other people, it comes from the sense that if we don't actually have a well to draw from of our own love, then we don't have much to offer to others. So we have to deepen our well in order to actually have something to pull from when we connect to another person, whether that person is a romantic partner, whether it's a family or a friend, whether it is something else entirely. There is some sense here of like we actually need to sort of replenish that well regularly in order to have this connection to our inherent. In Buddhism, we would call bodhicitta, bodhi being open or awake, citta being heart or mind, the sense of open and awake, tender heart that has the capacity to love boundlessly. So there's not a sense of like, oh, the well runs dry at a certain point, but we do need to make the floodgates open so that the well can be replenished and we have more to draw from.
And on that, you spoke about going to quite a few book tours and retreats and hearing people say that they felt inherently unlovable or defective, and that there was no way someone is going to love them and treat them well. Why do you think, from your perspective, that is? Is it society's influence? Where do you think it comes from?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do think that if we look at young children, there is this real openness, the sense of bodhicitta that I had mentioned before, that sense of, oh, I am inherently loving and lovable is just sort of there. And at a certain point, that glimmer is dulled. And it could be in schools, it could be in family situations, it could be amongst friends. But there's something where we start to say, oh, but maybe I should hide this part of myself, or maybe this isn't going to be an acceptable thing. And these days, I feel like the sort of societal whisper, because that's essentially what I'm referring to. The societal whisper is very prevalent. Whether it's the billboards that we see, whether it is things that we see in movies or online, or any number of sort of sources bombarding us for our attention 24/7, we have this thing that happens that we get this sense of like, oh, but maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I'm not inherently whole. Maybe I'm not inherently lovable. And this voice, and our sort of late stage capitalism, it is this sense of like, well, if you got X, Y, and Z, then you'll be happy. And X, Y, and Z could be if you got this perfect relationship, then you would be happy. If you found someone who, would really just be there for you, then you'd be happy. And then we get into a nice relationship, and then we say, well, really, what you need to get a house, then you'll be happy. You need to get a car, you need to have a better education, you need to have a better job, then you'll be happy. And we basically spend the majority of our life really chasing after these external pursuits instead of actually trying to find any sense of happiness or contentment within. So yes, we do have this sort of voice whispering in our ear saying, yeah, well, have you tried this? Have you tried that? And we spend a lot of our time really chasing after those elements of, well, if I get X, Y, and Z, then I'll be happy, as opposed to actually beginning to connect to the elements of love and acceptance and grace that are within us. So that's where it gets very interesting, because the acts of meditation, and on Megan's side, the acts of contemplation that we engage in are meant to anchor us, to connect us to however we want to describe these things, whether in her end it's divinity, whether it's my end a sense of basic goodness, that we are inherently, fundamentally, innately good, whole, complete. We can realize that in even the most basic forms of meditation. So throughout, at this point, there's been 7 books of different types and ilks, and books on work, and books on heartbreak, and books on social action, and all sorts of things. So there's really been sort of a wide array, but the core of it is that when we do the most basic of mindfulness practices, just being in the body, feeling the breath, allowing ourselves to come back repeatedly to the present moment through being with the breath when we get distracted by thought, that's when we start to notice, oh, underneath all of my swirling layers of confusion and neurosis and what's going to happen with next and what am I supposed to do with X, Y, and Z, then we start to say, wait a minute, when I get out of my own way, I actually feel that sense of wholeness. I feel that sense of goodness within myself. And that's where it starts to get very interesting, because it's no longer someone theoretically saying, you know, maybe you're basically good. Maybe you're not basically messed up. Maybe you aren't basically unlovable. The experience of, oh, I'm inherently love, I'm inherently good, comes to fruition. And we say, oh, even having a glimpse of that, I bet I can go further with that relationship. And that's where it gets very interesting, because the primary relationship at this point in the spiritual path becomes not how do I go get love from someone else? It's how do I actually cultivate this relationship with my innate goodness, my innate love and bodhicitta, so that I can live a life marked by love and kindness and grace without necessarily being dependent on any of these external factors that I mentioned. So you mentioned a particular story that when I first started traveling for my first book, which was The Buddha Walks into a Bar, I went to, God, dozens of cities. I don't remember how many, maybe 36, something like that. And everywhere I went, someone offered some version of, but I'm not enough. And sometimes it was around work, which gave birth to the book on work. But more often than not, it really was the sense of, my boyfriend doesn't ever tell me he loves me. I don't think I'm lovable. Based on my relationships, I don't think I'll ever find someone who loves me for me. Um, if people knew what I've done in my past, they would never love me. These sorts of very big and very concrete statements of people grappling with what I would call the trap of doubt, and not me, but like my tradition would call the trap of doubt. Meaning that we doubt our innate goodness, we doubt our ability to love. And that's something very insidious that sort of gets hooks into us very early, that we've been told that we are not worthy, not enough, whatever our version of it may be. And that's what it's known as the trap of doubt. If we could actually look at that directly and begin to unhook ourselves from it, then we would innately fall away into our feeling of basic goodness and love.
And that is something that is shared with humanistic psychologists and existential, where we do believe that we're basically good, and that behavior, maladaptive behavior, is separate from the basic goodness. So although we may behave from a wound, so if we hurt or with trauma, we hurt ourselves or others, that we're still operating from a sense of basic goodness. So could you enlighten us a bit on this basic goodness?
Sure. I think, particularly in common parlance, the idea of basic has gotten a bad rap, like, a basic bitch or something like that. But it's not sort of a negative thing. It's the sense of, if we swap that word out, it can be fundamental, innate, inherent, primordial, foundational. Any of these would sort of point to the fact that this is something that exists within us, and it's not something that we need to cultivate. It's not something we need to cultivate. It's something that we're born with. Basic goodness is a birthright. The goodness element isn't like a Star Wars good versus evil sort of thing. It's a sense of wholeness, completeness, okayness. So when I mention that we might experience this, and we often do in meditation, it's such a subtle experience that we don't often make a big deal out of it. We just sort of say, oh yeah, is this what he's talking about? Maybe it's that. And the way that looks is like we drop away from our thoughts. We drop away, sort of unhook ourselves, as I said, from the trap of doubt. And there's a moment where we are able to just rest and be with ourselves as we are. And in that moment, we say, I'm okay in this moment. There's nothing wrong. I'm here. I'm solid. I'm stable. We sort of have a basic appreciation of this experience of reality, this experience of the present moment. And that's it. In that moment, there's that sense of we are okay, we are whole, we are complete. So we can have glimpses, we could say, of basic goodness that then further develop into a long-lasting understanding or relationship to it. There is a very well-known term, tantra, and people get very sexy with their understanding what tantra is. Tantra, in its most basic form, could be translated as continuity. It's a continuity of the experience of wakefulness. At least in Buddhism, that is what we refer to it as. It's this sense of, oh, there's a moment where I realized my basic goodness. Oh, here's another one. I'm drinking water and I'm just tasting the water and I'm here and I'm okay. And there's another one. I'm with a friend or a loved one and I'm just present for the conversation. There's another one. And gradually we start to build a continuity between these glimpses of basic goodness so that we develop a further relationship and live through that lens, as opposed to, as you were saying, the lens of hurt behavior or clinging to mistakes or whatever it might be.
And with that inherent goodness, you brought about a really interesting topic about when we are single or away from a partner, we can either be free, which is really utilizing that space of becoming alone with ourselves and connecting with ourselves and getting to discover oneself through what you say, meditation and the breath and other activities of being present and aware within the self. And then you speak about free wild. So it seems like what you're describing is a distraction from self. It's almost anxious, that feeling that comes about in the book, is when there's serial dating or partying or drinking. And what are the dangers of going too much into the free wild space?
Yeah, this is a term that was developed, these two, by the Tibetan Buddhist teacher Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And it's that sense of free wild is when we just can't be with ourselves as we are, essentially. There's this sense of, I'm not okay. In this moment, I've got to act out. I've got to do something. I've got to distract myself. I should go on Netflix. I should go on Tinder. I should go on social media. I've got to move away from this present experience and fill up the space that exists in my life, as opposed to, as you said, free, which is a sense of, I'm okay to hang out with myself as I am. Like for people who are like, oh, that sounds great. The activities that come to mind off the top of my head are things like going for a walk by yourself without distraction, without headphones in and things like that. Riding a bike, being, with animals, some basic things where I'm like, I'm just going to give myself space to be with the thing without also filling it with ultimate other distractions. It's sort of the distinction between multitasking and single tasking. That you can't see my dog, but my dog is right over here. That when I'm with the dog and I'm paying attention to the dog, I'm just paying attention to the dog, right? And there's something of like, that's me just being in space with what is currently occurring. So sort of, I'm pointing at some somatic experiences here because they can be very grounding. Free wild is because we're trying to escape the present moment, we are fighting against it. We fill it up often with things that numb. So, literally, as I mentioned a few moments ago, my first book was called The Buddha Walks into a Bar. I'm not going to tell anyone not to drink or not to go out or anything like that. But I think to understand our intention behind these things can be very helpful. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But to answer the question more directly, the idea of being free wild, when we're constantly trying to move away from being with some strong emotions, we could exhaust ourselves by running off, filling up a lot of space. And then what happens when we are done with the night out, done with the date, done with online shopping and maxing out our credit card? We're exhausted and we don't necessarily always feel better about the situation and the emotion is still waiting for us. Or we tamp it down. And I often think about, when we try to avoid discomfort and fear and other strong emotions like that, when we tamp them down, I have this image of like Rocky, the movie Rocky, if anyone still remembers these things, where it's sort of the ultimate version of like an 80s training sequence where, I have the tigers. No, is that I have the tiger? Maybe it is. In any case, he's running the steps in Philadelphia. He's, boxing. He's doing all these different exercises and gradually gets better and then comes back in the final act of the movie and knocks the guy out. And it's sort of like that. It's like the emotion goes through some weird sequence while it's sort of being squashed down, comes back and knocks us out when we least expect it, because it comes back bigger, badder, and stronger than ever before. So there's lots of different versions of this. But I think, for anyone who's like, oh, when I'm grappling with things, I want to go talk to a friend or whatever it is, this is where I wanted to get into some of the intentionality, because if our intention is to connect to, I'm going to go meet up with a friend, my intention is to connect, I'm going to be there with them, I'm going to have a drink, but really my primary quote unquote goal here or aspiration would be to sort of get their support. That leads us into activity, which is based in us connecting with another person. And then at the end of it all, even if we've had a drink or two, we might feel very good. If we're not aware of our intentions around these things, we say, okay, I'm going to go out for a friend with a drink, or go out for a drink with a friend, and I've had a rough week, and man, I could really use a drink. And we're not really conscious of our intentions, and we end up saying, okay, I have a drink while I'm waiting for them, and then I'll have another one when they're here, and then we have 5 drinks, and we forget to even talk about the thing we want to talk to our friend about, and lo and behold, at the end of the day, we wake up hungover, and we actually don't really remember much of what we said, and it doesn't feel good. So to be conscious of our intentions is a really important aspect of the path in Buddhism, but to really then allow the activity to flow from the conscious intention so that the fruition, the end result of what happens, actually feels meaningful to us. So the threefold path that I just sort of teased out there is intention, knowing our intention, which leads into the second aspect of activity, so being present for whatever the activity is, and then that leads us into the third element of the fruition. So at the end of an act, saying, how did that feel? Did that feel uplifting? Do I want to continue to do that sort of thing? Did it feel draining? In which case, maybe I want to cut it out or not do it so much. So particularly around free wild stuff, it's like we can start to discern, when we feel burnt out after, when we feel like drained by the whole experience, maybe this isn't something that's actually helping my mental state.
I love that you had brought up some examples of being free, because certainly in psychotherapy, what's very predominant in a fast-paced society in Johannesburg is that people don't know how to do that. Is when you tell them, go and date yourself, go and do something that you want to do for you outside of your relationship or whilst you're trying to look for someone, is there's kind of this frenetic energy to use things or people as a shield against our isolation. But it can be flipped in terms of not only being isolated or alone, but being free, feeling a sense of freedom. If you could just tell us a bit more of some examples in terms of free that you've come across. We generally in psychotherapy come back to nature a lot, nature and self-reflection. But are there any other things that you could enlighten the viewers?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So when you're a meditation teacher, everything looks like an opportunity for meditation practice. The act of meditation itself is us becoming accustomed to space. So we are being present with something, again, simple, like the breath. And when we get distracted, we gently acknowledge that distraction, but we come back to the breath. So discomfort arises. Oh, I don't want to be here. I want to actually go finish X, Y, and Z. Oh my gosh, what am I doing after this? We acknowledge those thoughts. We come back to the breath. And this trains the mind. It literally rewires the brain so that we don't have to go chasing after every time we get distracted or feel discomfort. Along these lines, yes, meditation. I think what you mentioned is very helpful. One meditation teacher, Dr. Larry Ward, is very fond of not just the somatic work, but also the work in nature, where, he says that every morning the first thing he does is he gets up and he goes to a particular tree in his backyard and he just places his hands on it. And there's something about being connected, rooted to nature that can be very healing in that regard, because nature is always present. Nature isn't thinking about what's going to happen with their tax situation. It's just here. So the idea of being in nature, being in the body, those are very important things. So one of the things I often recommend, particularly for anyone who's going through a lot of difficulty, a lot of grief, a lot of heartbreak, is to engage in what is known as the 4 exhilarations. So these are 4 elements that I believe are done in Taoist literature, covered there, but Tibetan Buddhism, is held sort of secret in the mountains for many years in these monasteries. I'm not sure why, it's very secret teachings, but it is the sort of thing where if you do these 4 things, it said, in the course of a day, you will have unlimited energy. And those 4 are that you would eat well, that you would sleep well, that you would meditate, and that you would exercise. These are very simple things. And yet, when was the last time we did all 4 in a day? We might sleep in and say, oh, I feel really good that I got enough sleep. And they would say, well, I can skip meditation because I'm running late. I got to get to work. Or we go to the gym, we feel very good about going to the gym, but we eat like crap afterwards because we burned calories earlier, and who cares about eating well at that point? So it's sort of like figuring out how to balance these four is the real tricky part. I think we all know that we should do these things, but to actually prioritize them as acts of self-care, as acts of self-love, to allow them to nurture us and to become more in the body as a result of all of them. That when we sleep well, we get enough sleep, when we eat well, when we actually move the body, when I say exercise, it'd be anything. It's going for a walk, yoga, CrossFit, whatever you do. And of course, meditation. These are all acts of being in the body, being in the present moment. And to treat them as real opportunities to just be with ourselves is indeed us being with space as well.
And as you say that with regard to why we tend to not prioritize those four things, it seems as though, certainly from psychotherapy perspective, that it feels a bit self-indulgent to do that. You would tell your child to do that, or your partner or your parent to do that, but not necessarily take it as pivotal as to yourself.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the other part, that I think many of us, us good-hearted human beings, we would like everyone else to be really happy and everyone else to be the objects of our compassion. And to quote Jack Kornfield, he has famously said that if your compassion does not include yourself, it is incomplete. And that's it. It's not instead of, it's also. We also have to include ourselves in our understanding of love and compassion.
And as most important, because as you said right in the beginning, if we don't have that well that's replenished, we can't give out. We can't replenish the relationships and networks. I wanted to touch on something that was brought up in the book that is of great interest to psychotherapists, which is codependency versus interdependency. And I love how it's put in the book, where it's explained that codependency is not, or it's seen as a rescuing or a completing of self, and that's why a lot of people hold on and cling on to others in relationships. Whereas interdependency is a full person observing and accepting the person as they are, as they're evolving, not controlling, not wishing, and it enhances you as a person in this relationship and enlarges your sense of self, but it doesn't complete or rescue you. Could you bring about a bit more insight into what your thoughts are?
Of course, I'm happy to, although what you said is actually quite lovely and well said. I think, somewhere in this book we quote an even older book, or an even older movie, which is Jerry Maguire. I don't know if anyone listening even saw this movie, but, there's this pivotal moment where the romance culminates in Tom Cruise's character, Jerry Maguire, saying, "You complete me." And that's the whole thing. It's like, I am not complete without the other person, which is a romantic thing to say, but also, as you said, sort of like deeply codependent and also not particularly great because, when that person's not there, all of a sudden we don't feel like we have the resources to actually function as humans. My dear friend Susan Piver and I, who's another Buddhist teacher, she's written some books on this topic as well, in contemplating the Buddhist notion / just basic reality of our situation, which is impermanence. We said, what was the best situation that we could do to eliminate the most amount of heartbreak in the course of our life? And the best we could ever come up with is that the way to eliminate the most heartbreak is to have everyone that you've ever loved and know get on one airplane, and you get on another, and no one has self-service, and you all crash into mountains at the exact same time so that no one actually has to mourn anyone's loss. That's the best we've come up with. But assuming that doesn't happen, we will live a life where there are people who come into our life for periods of time, and then they are no longer there for periods of time. It could be because of breakup, it could be because of divorce, it could be because of death. But one of those things is going to happen. I would love that, my wife and I sort of fight each other over who gets to die first. Seems like, if I do, then she has to mourn me, which is a bummer, but, I'd rather that than me having to mourn her. And, that's a little selfish of me, but there you go. The tangent aside, so dwelling on, like, the truth of the matter is, like, it's inherently flawed for us to get extremely dependent upon and to think that someone else completes us. Instead, a healthier thing would be to, as we talked about before, tap into that feeling of basic goodness, love, um, deep kindness for ourselves. And then we can draw from that in our relationship. So if we feel whole, complete, and we are complete as is, I am solid, I'm good, we come at whatever relationships, and again, this could be romantic, but it could be family, it could be friends, it could be other things, from a place of I am enough, I have enough, and you are welcome to be a part of this life, but I don't need something from you. And that lack of poverty mentality, that lack of neediness, can actually go a long way in building relationships that are actually built in strength. So even if someone else is a little bit like clingy or needy or something, there's still the sense of, okay, but I don't need to mirror that back. And in fact, us mirroring back the sense of wholeness and completeness is a real gift to other people. So from that sense, I think this interdependent element that you're referring to, in Buddhism, we would say this is a whole other thing because everyone is interdependent, that we're all sort of part of this giant system of Mother Nature at this point. And, when I go and buy a cheeseburger or something like that, that would affect all the local farms and the restaurant and the people that deliver the meat and all, like there's anything, and that's just a random example. I don't eat a lot of cheeseburgers, but the notion that whatever I do, whatever purchase I make, if I go on Amazon or to a local store, or whether I decide to smile at my neighbor or not smile at my neighbor, this all has an effect on the beings around me. So that we're constantly in relationship to and interdependent as humans with the beings around us and the ripple effect that that has on society overall. But from a therapeutic point of view, the way that you're talking about this notion of interdependence, that sense of like just I am enough, I have enough, to put that out into the world, whether you look at it through one lens or another, is ultimately beneficial, and ultimately does lead us to the sense of magnetizing the level of love and basic goodness that exists in the world around us.
And to also understand that people are basically good as well, even if they are operating from that wound or trauma that we spoke about. And I love what you had said now with that impermanent state, that many people try to either get married, get into a relationship, or get a career in order to circumvent change and instability. But in actual fact, we as existential therapists also, we believe that nothing is permanent. There's nothing that can govern things in terms of our lives that we can control apart from how do we react to it. Could you comment on that? That's our last question.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't think I have much more to add than what you just beautifully said. I think there is some really beautiful element here of sort of taking personal responsibility for ourselves. And I think some of the things that you mentioned feel a little scary, like, oh, there is impermanence, there is potential heartbreak and things like that. But there is, again, the meditation teacher is going to talk about the meditation practice. Within this practice of so shamatha, calm abiding, or peaceful abiding meditation, often referred to as mindfulness, there's an element of becoming very familiar with all of who we are. And through becoming very familiar with all of who we are, becoming very self-sufficient, that we don't have to rely on others, that we don't have to always look to other people and relationships or whatever it might be to feel okay about ourselves. That okayness comes from within. This basic goodness is something that is always present, that we can cultivate a long-term relationship with. And through that, even though there are things like impermanence and heartbreak and breakups and all of those things, we feel okay. And that's the slight distinction, I think, that many people grapple with. It's like, no, something bad happened to me, versus that means I'm not okay or I'm not lovable or whatever it is that we were talking about earlier. Those are two very different things. Impermanence, heartbreak, those things happen as part of life. To internalize and say that makes me bad, wrong, not enough, whatever it is optional. There's an old analogy, and I realize we're sort of coming short on our time, so I'll be brief about it, known as the two arrows. that if you're going for a walk in the woods, and out of nowhere, a arrow comes and hits you in the arm, that this is known as the first arrow, that there is pain. And this pain happens as part of life, that there is breakups, that there is upsets in relationships, that there are major life transitions. These things happen. So there's the first arrow. The second arrow is us going, who shot me? I bet it was Chuck. Chuck always wants to go after me. No one else ever gets shot. It's always me that gets shot. And all of the stories that we then layer on top of ourselves. Now, if we were smart, we would just start tending to our healing, take out the arrow and patch ourselves up. But instead, we spin out. So the first arrow, as I said, these are things that happen as part of life. We will unfortunately get some arrows. The second arrow is the optional one. Do we want to spin off? Do we want to spend our lifetime essentially losing ourselves in anxiety and stories and all sorts of things? Or do we want to more quickly acknowledge that we don't have to do that, come back to the present moment and tend to the healing that can actually be of benefit to ourselves? Mm-hmm. If we do that, if we can train in that, and again, this is what meditation is so helpful around, then we actually can live a life that feels very meaningful and a life that helps us navigate some of the ups and downs of life overall.
Well, thank you so much, Lodro, for your time. And how can the viewers find you?
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about having a name like Rinzler is that you sort of get all the names and the Instagram handles and things like that. And, my website is lodrorinzler.com, and when people reach out through that, I'm always happy to get back to them. It's not like there's some secret team that answers my emails or anything. It's always me at the end of the day. Tending to whoever's writing to me. And my books are wherever books are sold. And if you did want to engage in social media, I would say Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, in terms of order of things I actually am on and share on. Those are probably all good, and Lodro Rinzler is where to find me.
And do you provide private meditation classes?
That's a good question. Yes. I run sort of an annual 6-month-long everything you would ever want to know about Buddhism, and it is sort of comprehensive. It's sort of like every week there is a new teaching on different elements of Buddhism. So anyone who wants to get quote unquote serious about studying Buddhism, it's a good program for them. But I also have an online community where I do indeed work with people one-on-one and release more informal teachings every other week.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your time. And I will be providing the links below in the description to contact you or to purchase your books. Can they get it from Amazon?
Sure. Yeah. Wherever books are sold, really. Wherever you like to purchase books.
Okay. Thank you so much, Lodro.
My pleasure.
All right, guys. So that was Lodro Rinzler with us, going through how to start loving yourself and sometimes other people too. Please check out his book. I'll put the link below and some links to contact him if you'd like more information. All the best.